Shadow of Man, Chapter 6. The Chimps Come to Camp. 1961 was a cold winter in England, and in Cambridge, with the winds whistling over the flat country straight from the icy wastes of Norway, the snow and the frost and the frozen water pipes seemed interminable. I felt utterly remote from Africa and the chimpanzees and all that I longed for most at that time. Of course, I was immensely grateful for the privilege of going to Cambridge and for the chance of working under the supervision of Professor Robert Hind. But what was David Greybeard doing in the meantime? How were Goliath and Flo? What was I missing? At long last, the spring thawed the hard ground. In 2 months, I would be back in Africa. First, I had 2 ordeals to face, and the thought of them terrified me far more than any encounter with enraged chimpanzees. I had to speak at an international conference, 2 conferences, in London and in New York. For other scientists were avid for information, first-hand information, about the ways of my chimpanzees. But these milestones came and went at last, unbelievably. 6 months' exile were over, and I was heading for Africa again, crossing the vastness of the Sahara Desert in the lurid red light of dawn that is so much an integral part of modern air travel. Then the fears that had haunted me in England came to a head. Would the chimpanzees have forgotten me? Would I have to get them used to me all over again? I need not have worried. When I got back to the Gombe stream, it seemed that the chimps were, if anything, more tolerant of my presence than before. I resumed my work in the mountains as though I'd never been away. One evening I returned to camp and found Dominic and Hassan very excited. A large male chimpanzee, they told me, had walked right into camp and spent an hour feeding from the palm tree that shaded my tent. The following evening, I learned that the same chimp had paid another visit. I determined to stay down the next day to see if he came again. It seemed strange to lie in my bed and watch the dawn break, to have breakfast in camp, to sit in my tent in the daylight to type out my previous day's notes on the typewriter that I brought back from England. And it seemed quite unbelievable when, at about 10 o'clock, David Greybeard strolled calmly past the front of my tent and climbed the palm tree. I peeped out and heard him giving low-pitched grunts of pleasure as he poked the first red fruit from its horny case. An hour later, he climbed down, paused to look quite deliberately into the tent, and wandered off. After all those months of despair, when the chimpanzees had fled at the mere sight of me 500 yards away, here was one making himself at home in my very camp. No wonder I found it hard to believe. David Greybeard paid regular visits until the palm tree's fruit was finished, and then he stopped coming. These oil-nut palms do not all fruit at the same time, however, and so a few weeks later, the hard nut-like fruits on another of the camp palms became red and ripe. David Greybeard resumed his daily visits. I didn't often stay to watch him, for there was a limit to the amount of information I could gain from watching a lone male guzzling palm nuts. Sometimes, though, I waited for him to come just for the intense pleasure of seeing him so close and so unafraid. One day, as I sat on the veranda of the tent, David climbed down from his tree and then, in his deliberate way, walked straight towards me. When he was about 5 feet from me, he stopped, and slowly his hair began to stand on end until he looked enormous and very fierce. A chimpanzee may erect his hair when he's angry, frustrated, or nervous. Why, I wondered somewhat apprehensively, had David put his hair out? All at once he ran straight at me, snatched up a banana from my table, and hurried off to eat it further away. Gradually his hair returned to its normal sleeked position. After that incident, I asked Dominic to leave bananas out whenever he saw David, and so even when there were no ripe palm nuts, the chimp still wandered into camp sometimes, looking for bananas. But his visits were irregular and unpredictable, and I no longer waited in my tent for him to come. About 8 weeks after my return to the Gombe, I had a slight attack of malaria. I stayed in bed, and hoping that David Greybeard might pass by, asked Dominic to set out some bananas. Late that morning, indeed, David walked up to my tent and helped himself to the fruit. As he walked back towards the bushes, I suddenly saw a second chimpanzee was standing there, half hidden in the vegetation. Quickly I reached for my binoculars. It was Goliath. As David sat down to eat, Goliath went close to him, peering into his face. As David rolled a banana skin wedge around in his lower lip, squeezing out the last juices and occasionally pushing it forward to look down at it over his nose, Goliath reached out one hand to his friend's mouth, begging for the wedge. Presently David responded by spitting out the by now well-chewed mass into Goliath's hand, and then Goliath sucked it in turn. The next day Goliath followed David to camp again. I kept hidden right inside my tent with the flap down and peeped out through a small hole. This time Goliath, with much hesitation and with all his hair on end, followed David to the tent and seized some bananas for himself. The following few weeks were momentous. I sent Hassan off to the village of Mwamgongo to the north of the reserve to buy a supply of bananas, and each day I put out a pile near my tent. The figs in the home valley were ripe again, so that large groups of chimps were constantly passing near camp. I spent part of my time up near the fig trees, and the remainder waiting for David in camp. He came nearly every day. And not only did Goliath sometimes accompany him, but William also, and occasionally a youngster. One day when David came by himself, I held a banana out to him in my hand. He approached, put his hair out, and gave a quick, soft exhalation, rather like a cough, whilst at the same time he jerked his chin up. Oh. He was mildly threatening me. Oh. Suddenly, he stood upright, swaggered slightly from foot to foot, slapped the trunk of a palm tree beside him with one hand, and then, very gently, took the banana from me. The first time I offered Goliath a banana from my hand was very different. He too put his hair out, then seized a chair and charged past me, almost knocking me over. Then he sat and glowered from the bushes. It was a long time before he behaved as calmly in my presence as David. If I made a sudden movement and startled him, he often threatened me quite vigorously, uttering a soft barking sound whilst rapidly raising one arm or swaying branches with quick, rather jerky movements. It was exciting to be able to make fairly regular observations on the same individuals, but previously I had found this almost impossible. Chimpanzees follow no set route on their daily wanderings, and so except when a good fruit tree had been ripe, it had only been by chance that I observed the same chimpanzee more than a few times in any 1 month. In camp, however, I was able to make detailed observations on social interactions between David, Goliath, and William several times a week. Often, too, I saw incidents involving one of the three when I was watching the chimpanzee groups feeding on figs in the home valley. It was at this point that I began to suspect that Goliath might be the highest-ranking male chimpanzee in the area, and later I found out that this was indeed the case. If William and Goliath started to move towards the same banana at the same time, it was William who gave way, and Goliath who took the fruit. If Goliath met another adult male along a narrow forest track, he continued, the other stepped aside. Goliath was nearly always the first to be greeted when a newcomer climbed into a fig tree to join a feeding group of chimpanzees. One day I actually saw him driving another chimp from her nest in order to take it over for himself. It was nearly dark when I observed this from the peak. The young female had constructed a large leafy nest and was peacefully lying there, curled up for the night. Suddenly, Goliath swung up onto the branch beside her, and after a moment stood upright, seized an overhead branch, and began to sway it violently back and forth over her head. With a loud scream, she leapt out of bed and vanished into the darkening undergrowth below. Goliath climbed instantly into her vacated nest, bent over a new branch, and lay down. 5 minutes later, the ousted female was still constructing a new bed in the last glimmers of dusk. William, with his long scarred upper lip and his drooping lower lip, was one of the more subordinate males in his relationship with the other chimpanzees. If another adult male showed signs of aggression towards him, William was quick to approach with gestures of appeasement and submission, reaching out to lay his hand on the other, crouching with soft panting grunts in front of a higher-ranking individual. During such an encounter, he would often pull back the corners of his lips and expose his teeth in a nervous grin. Initially, William was timid in camp also. When I offered him a banana in my hand for the first time, he stared at it for several moments, gently shook a branch in his frustration, and then sat, offering soft whimpering sounds until I relented and put the fruit on the ground. I was very fond of William. It took me much longer to determine David Greybeard's position in the dominance hierarchy. In those days, I only knew he had a very calm and gentle disposition. If William or some youngster approached him with submissive gestures, David was always quick to respond with a reassuring gesture, laying his hand on the other's body or head, or briefly grooming him. Often, too, if Goliath showed signs of excitement in camp, if I approached too closely, for example, David would reach out and lay his hand gently in his companion's groin, or make a few brief grooming strokes on Goliath's arm. Such gestures nearly always seemed to calm the more dominant male. It was during these weeks that Hugo arrived at the Gombe stream. I had at last, rather reluctantly, agreed that a professional photographer be allowed to come and photograph the chimpanzees, and Lewis had recommended Hugo. The National Geographic Society had accepted the advice and given Hugo funds for filming me and the chimpanzees, partly to obtain a documentary film record of as much behavior as possible, and partly in the hope of being able to prepare a lecture film for their members. Hugo was born in Indonesia, educated in England and Holland, and like myself, had always loved animals. He chose photography as a career, on the assumption that he would somehow and sometime get to Africa and film wild animals. After 2 years of working in a film studio in Amsterdam, he was accepted by Armand and Michaela Dennis to help with the filming of their well-known TV program On Safari. It was actually one of the first of those series, one of the very first. Hugo arrived in Africa, in fact, 1 year after I did. While he was working for the Dennises, Hugo got to know the Leakeys, for they were practically neighbours, and after 2 years, he agreed to make a lecture film for the National Geographic Society on Lewis's work at Olduvai Gorge. It was during this period that Lewis decided that Hugo would be just the person to go to the Gombe stream, where he realized that Hugo was not only an excellent photographer, but also he had a very real love and understanding of animals. Lewis wrote to tell me about Hugo and his abilities. At the same time, he wrote to Van, telling her he'd found someone just right as a husband for Jane. He didn't tell me that, by the way, nor did Mum. I still felt some apprehension as to how the chimpanzees would tolerate a man with a load of photographic equipment, but I realized the importance of getting a documentary film record of the chimpanzee's behavior. Also, there was David Greybeard. I did not anticipate that David would be too upset by the arrival of a stranger. On Hugo's first morning at the Gombe stream, David Greybeard arrived very early in camp, for he'd nested nearby. I decided it might be best if David first got used to the new tent and then to its occupant. So, whilst David ate his bananas, Hugo remained inside, peering out through the flaps. David scarcely glanced at the tent until his meal was finished. Then he walked deliberately over, pulled back one of the flaps, stared at Hugo, grunted, and plodded away in his usual leisurely manner. To my surprise, Goliath and even timid William, who arrived together a short while afterwards, also accepted Hugo with very little fuss. It was as though they regarded him as merely part of the furniture of the camp. And so on his first day, Hugo was able to get some excellent film of interactions, greetings, groomings, and begging for food between the three males. And on his second day, Hugo was able to get some even more remarkable film, shots of chimpanzees eating a monkey. Since that memorable day when I first watched David Greybeard feeding on the carcass of a young bush pig, I'd only once seen meat eaten again. On that occasion, the prey had been a young bush buck, but again, I couldn't be sure the chimps had caught it themselves. But on this third occasion, Hugo and I actually witnessed the hunt and kill. It happened most unexpectedly. I'd taken Hugo up to show him the peak, and we were watching 4 red colobus monkeys that were, it seemed, separated from their troop. Suddenly, an adolescent male chimpanzee climbed cautiously up the tree next to the monkeys and moved slowly along a branch. Then he sat down. 3 of the monkeys, after a moment, jumped away, quite calmly it seemed. The 4th remained, his head turned towards the chimp. A second later, another adolescent male chimpanzee climbed out of the thick vegetation surrounding the tree, rushed along the branch on which the last monkey was sitting, and grabbed it. Instantly, several other chimps climbed up into the tree and, screaming and barking in excitement, tore their victim into several pieces. It was all over within a minute from the time of capture. We were too far away for Hugo to film the hunt, and anyway it happened so suddenly he could hardly have expected to do so, even had we been close enough. But he did get some film of the chimpanzees eating their share of the kill, though from very far away to be sure. After such a startlingly auspicious beginning, however, Hugo's luck changed. True, he was able to get a great deal of excellent cine film and still photography of David, William, and Goliath, but he needed for his documentary record more than that. He needed film of as many aspects of chimpanzee life as possible, their life in the mountains and forests, and most of them fled from Hugo just as 2 years earlier they had fled from me. Even Goliath and William distrusted him when they met him in the forest. As I had done prior to Judy's visit, I'd constructed a few ramshackle hides for Hugo, close to trees that I expected would bear fruit. I'd even stuck empty bottles through the wall to try to get the chimps used to the sight of camera lenses. Somehow, though, they instantly detected the difference when they spied real lenses, and if they did arrive in the tree, they usually stared intently towards the hide and vanished silently. Poor Hugo. He lugged most of his camera equipment up and down the steep slopes himself so as not to create the added disturbance of taking an African to help him. He spent long hours perched on steep rocky hillsides or down on the softer earth of the valley floors that always seemed to harbour biting ants. Frequently no chimps came at all. When they did, they often left before he could get even a foot of film. However, it seemed that the chimps, having very slowly got used to one white-skinned ape in the area, and having then had the chance to study a second very similar-looking ape in the person of my sister, took a relatively short time to accept the third, and David Greybeard hastened the process. Occasionally, when he saw Hugo or me, he would leave his group and come to see whether by any chance we had a banana. The other chimps, of course, watched intently. When David, William, and Goliath had started visiting camp, I had soon discovered that they loved chewing on cloth and cardboard, sweaty garments, presumably because of their salty flavour, were the most sought after. One day, when Hugo was crouched in a small hide by a large fruiting tree, a group of chimps climbed up and began to feed. They didn't, it appeared, notice him at all. Just as he was beginning to film, he felt his camera being pulled away from him. For a moment, he couldn't imagine what was going on. Then he suddenly saw a black, hairy hand pulling at the old shirt, which he'd wrapped around his camera to try to camouflage the shiny surface of the lenses. Of course, it was David Greybeard. He'd walked along the valley path behind Hugo, and then, when he got level with the hide, spied the tempting material. Hugo grabbed hold of one end and engaged in a frenzied tug-of-war until the shirt finally split, and David plodded off to join the group in the tree with his spoils in one hand. The other chimps had watched these proceedings with apparent interest, and after that they tolerated Hugo's filming, even though, during the struggle with David, most of the hide had collapsed. In fact, it was only a month after he arrived before most of the chimpanzees accepted not only Hugo, but also his clicking, whirring cameras, providing he kept still and did not move around. But the rains once again started early, and just as the weather had consistently ruined Judy's few photographic opportunities the year before, so it was with Hugo. Day after day he sat in his hides, the sun shining, the lighting perfect, but with no chimpanzees to film. Then a group arrived, everything was just right, and almost as though prearranged, it began to rain. Nevertheless, Hugo did, over the weeks, get some first-rate material and chimpanzee behavior in the mountains. Also, of course, he continued to film interactions between David, Goliath, and William in camp. One of my problems from the time when I first tried to tempt David and the others to my camp with bananas had been that of the baboons. There was never a day when the troop didn't pass through camp, and some of the males often hung around on their own, as old Shaitani had done, in the hope that bananas would appear. One day, when David, William, and Goliath were sitting around a large pile of bananas, a particularly aggressive male baboon suddenly ran at them. William retired from the fray almost immediately, his lips wobbling in his agitation, and with the few bananas he had managed to seize, watched the ensuing battle from a safe distance. David also ran from the baboon when first it threatened him, but he then approached Goliath, who was calmly ignoring the commotion and finishing his bananas, and flung his arms around his friend. Then, as though made brave by the contact, he turned to scream and wave his arms at the baboon. Again the baboon threatened him, lunging forward, and again David rushed to embrace Goliath. This time Goliath responded. He got up, ran a few steps towards the baboon, and then leapt time and time again into the air in an upright posture, waving his arms and uttering his fierce wah or threat bark. David Greybeard joined in, but it was noticeable that he kept a few feet behind Goliath from the start. The baboon retreated, but a moment later, avoiding Goliath, it rushed to lunge and slap at David. This happened again and again. Goliath leapt at the baboon, and the baboon, avoiding him with ease, managed each time to hit out at David, no matter how the latter tried to hide behind his friend. Eventually it was David and Goliath who retreated, leaving the baboon to grab the spoils of victory and rush off to a safer distance. Hugo managed to film the entire incident, and to this day it remains one of the best records of an aggressive encounter between chimpanzees and baboons. The National Geographic Society had agreed to finance Hugo's work at the Gombe stream until the end of November, so that he would be able to film the chimpanzees using tools during the termite season. I expected this to start, as in previous years, during October, but although Hugo and I daily examined different termite mounds, we saw no signs of any activity until early November. Then, when Hugo had only just over 2 weeks longer at the Gombe, the termites finally began to cooperate. One day, when Hugo made his pilgrimage to his favorite nest near camp, he saw a few moist spots. He scratched away the newly sealed over passages, poked the grass down, and to his delight felt the insects grip on. But the chimpanzees perversely showed no desire to eat termites. During the following week, David, William, and Goliath passed the heap frequently, but never paused to examine it. Hugo grew desperate. He even led David Gradier to the termite nest one day, walking along ahead of him with a banana in one hand. And while the chimp sat there eating the fruit, offered him a straw full of clinging termites. David glanced at them and then hit the straw from Hugo's hand with a soft threat bark. However, during Hugo's last 10 days, the chimpanzees finally demonstrated their skill in tool using and tool making. Hugo was able to film and take still photographs of David, William, and Goliath working at the camp termite heap. It was exciting material, and Hugo hoped it would help him to persuade the Geographic Society to let him return the following year and continue filming the chimpanzees. When Hugo left at the end of November, I was alone again. I still was not lonely, yet I was not as completely happy in my aloneness as I had been before Hugo came. For I had found in Hugo a companion with whom I could share not only the joys and frustrations of my work, but also my love of the chimpanzees, of the forests and mountains, of life in the wilderness. He had been with me into some of the wild, secret places where I had thought no other white person would ever tread. Together, we had roasted in the sun and shivered under polythene in the rain. In Hugo, I knew I had found a kindred spirit, one whose appreciation and understanding of animals was on a level with my own. Small wonder that I missed him when he was gone. I shall always remember Christmas at Gombe Stream that year. I brought an extra large supply of bananas and put them round a little tree, which I decorated with silver paper and cotton wool. Goliath and William arrived together on Christmas morning and gave loud screams of excitement when they saw the huge pile of fruit. They flung their arms around one another, and Goliath patted William again and again on his wide-open, screaming mouth, whilst William laid one arm over Goliath's back. Finally, they calmed down and began their feast, still uttering small squeaks and grunts of pleasure, somewhat muffled and sticky through their mouthfuls of banana. David arrived much later on his own. I sat close behind him as he ate his bananas. He seemed extra calm, and after a while I very slowly moved my hand towards his shoulder and made a grooming movement. He brushed me away, but so casually that after a moment I ventured to try again, and that time he actually allowed me to groom him. For at least a minute. Then he gently pushed my hand away once more, but he had let me touch him, tolerated physical contact with a human, and he was a fully adult male chimpanzee who lived all his life in the wild. It was a Christmas gift I shall always treasure. I remember it, even today. I had invited some of the Africans and their children for tea. At first the children were very nervous and ill at ease, but when I produced paper hats and balloons and a few little toys, it was so exciting that their reserve was soon gone, and they were laughing and chasing around and thoroughly enjoying themselves. Idi Matata, in his stately way, was entranced by the balloons. When the party was over, I felt a need to go up to the peak for an hour or so by myself before darkness fell. Then I hurried down to enjoy the Christmas dinner, which Dominic had been telling me about for days. He and Hugo had planned it in minute detail, from the stuffing of the chicken to the custard to the plum pudding. They planned it before Hugo left. It was dark when I returned to camp, my mouth watering in anticipation, only to find that Dominic, meanwhile, had been celebrating Christmas in his own way. Laid out on my table was one unopened tin of woolly beef, an empty plate, a knife and a fork, and that was my Christmas dinner. When I asked Dominic about the chicken and all the rest of it, he only laughed uproariously and repeated again and again, "Tomorrow." Then he went off, still giggling weakly, with a 4-gallon can of local beer, which I later heard had been brought down by a well-wisher from Bubango. Bubango is the village on the mountain top. I couldn't help chuckling as I ate my frugal repast, and Dominic certainly made up for it when he cooked the meal on Boxing Day, despite his king-sized hangover. Shortly after Christmas, I had to leave the Gombe stream myself for another term at Cambridge. My last 2 weeks were sad, for William fell ill. His nose ran, his eyes watered, and he constantly coughed, a dry, hacking cough that shook his entire body. The first day of William's illness, I followed him when he left camp, but by that time I was able to move about the forest with both William and David, although Goliath still threatened me if I tried to follow him. William went a few hundred yards along the valley, climbed into a tree, and made himself a large and leafy nest. There he lay until about 3 in the afternoon, wheezing and coughing, and sometimes apparently dozing. Several times he actually urinated whilst lying in his bed, behaviour so unusual I knew he must be feeling very bad indeed. When he finally got up, he fed on a few bits and pieces of leaf and vine, wandered slowly back to camp, ate a couple of bananas, and then climbed into a tree just beside my tent and made another nest. That night I stayed out, for there was a moon. At about 1 o'clock, heavy clouds invaded the sky from the east. Soon it began to rain. I was crouched some way up the steep slope of the mountain at a slightly higher level than William's nest, and when I shone my powerful torch in his direction, I could just make out his huddled figure sitting up in his wet bed with his knees up to his chin and his arms around his legs. For the rest of the night it rained on and off, and the silences between the pattering of raindrops were punctuated by William's hacking cough. Once, at the start of a really heavy deluge, William gave a few rather tremulous pant-hoots, and then was silent. When he climbed down in the morning, I saw that every few moments his body shook with violent spasms of shivering. As he shivered, his long, slack lips wobbled, but it was no longer funny. I longed to be able to wrap a warm blanket around him and give him a steaming hot toddy, but all I could offer were a few chilly bananas. I was with William almost all the time for a week. He spent his days in the vicinity of camp and many hours lying in different nests. Several times he joined David and Goliath for a while, but when they moved off up the mountainside, he turned back as though he couldn't face a long journey. One morning I was sitting near William, a little way up the mountain above camp, when a boat arrived with some visitors from Kigoma, for by then David Greybeard's fame had spread, and people sometimes came for a Sunday picnic in the hope of seeing him. I should, of course, have gone down to say hello, but I'd become so attuned to William that I almost felt myself the chimp's instinctive distrust of strangers. When William moved down towards the tents, I followed him. When he sat in the bushes opposite my camp, I sat beside him. Together we watched the visitors. They had coffee and chatted for a while, and then, since there was no sign of David or me, they left. I often wondered what they would have thought if they'd known that I was sitting there with William, peering at them as though they'd been alien creatures from an unknown world. One morning, 2 days before I had to leave, William stole a blanket from Dominic's tent. He'd been sitting chewing on it for a while when David Greybeard arrived, and after eating some bananas, joined William at the blanket. For half an hour or so, the two sat peacefully side by side, each sucking noisily and contentedly on different corners. But then William, like the clown he so often appeared to be, put part of the blanket right over his head and made groping movements with his hands as he tried to touch David from within the strange darkness he had created. David stared for a moment and then patted William's hand. Presently the two wandered off into the forest together, leaving me with the echo of a dry, hacking cough and the blanket lying on the ground. I never saw William again.